Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much indeed for joining me this afternoon. This is another in the series of the Goldsmith Chambers mini webinars. They are bite-sized pieces of webinar for you to break up your afternoon and hopefully to provide you with some information that you will find useful in your daily practice. I'm anticipating that this will probably take about a half an hour, perhaps a little bit longer, depending on whether there are questions at the end. In terms of questions and answers, you can see that there's a little box at the bottom of the screen there, and that will allow you to submit questions. I'm very ably assisted by my colleague Kezia Tobin today, for whose technical support I'm most grateful, and she will be going through the questions. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to have the time to answer every single question, but I will try my best. So today we're going to be talking about Afghan refugees and protection claims. And the way in which I'm going to be doing this is in respect of two key pieces of case law that came out last year. The first being, of course, AS Safety of Kabul, Afghanistan, which is the country guidance case that was first promulgated in 2018, in fact, but then made its way up to the Court of Appeal, particularly on an Article 15C basis, and then came back down again. But also I'm going to be looking at a subsequent case, which is DH Particular Social Group, Mental Health, Afghanistan, which followed on from some of the findings in AS. And the way I'm going to be approaching it, I mean, obviously, I think we're all the same. When a country guidance case falls on your desk and it's 100 or 120 pages long, the first thing that goes through your head is, oh my goodness, how many times am I going to have to read this and how long is this going to take me? What I'm trying to do today is to just go through the key head notes, and there are 5 key head notes in AS, and relate that to what that means in terms of what you need to be looking at, what we all need to be looking at when we're dealing with Afghan protection claims. So I'm going to start off with head note 1, and this comes under the general heading of risk on return to Kabul from the Taliban. And Taliban is an interesting word here, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But what head note 1 says is a person who is of lower level interest for the Taliban, i.e. not a senior government or security services official or a spy, is not at real risk of persecution from the Taliban in Kabul. Now, as I said, the interesting thing about that is it only refers to the Taliban. So it doesn't actually, AS doesn't actually deal with risk from other state or non-state actors at all. It doesn't either address risk to minorities. I mean, it maintains cases such as AK, country guidance cases such as AK and AA unaccompanied minors in respect of women and children. But it doesn't address ethnic minorities or religious minorities, for example, Hazara. And although it does contain some information and some statistics in respect of different areas of Afghanistan, there are no firm findings of fact as to the extent of risk outside of Kabul itself. So we really are only dealing with Kabul. But the other interesting point, of course, is referring, and I'll just go back to that screen, referring to, i.e. not a senior government or security services official or a spy. It doesn't really seem to address what would happen if you are deemed to be wrongly, or it is imputed upon you that you are associated with the government or associated with the security services in some way. So those are all points that need to be taken into account when considering how it is you're going to frame your claim. The next head note comes under the heading of risk of serious harm in Kabul. So now we've established that it's really only Kabul that AS is looking at all. And that informs us that there is widespread and persistent conflict-related violence in Kabul. However, the proportion of the population affected by indiscriminate violence is small and not at a level where a returnee, even one with no family or other network and who has no experience of living in Kabul, would face a serious and individual threat to their life or person by reasons of indiscriminate violence. So this really is the Article 15C of the EU Qualification Directive point. AS does not find that Article 15C threshold is met, as the risk of death or indiscriminate violence is small, although they do actually recognise, and again this might be something that can be taken into account when framing your claim, they do recognise that somebody who is likely to be economically active and therefore most likely to be going to the places which are targeted by the Taliban is likely to be at a higher risk than somebody who isn't. But they do make the points in terms of security overall, albeit that they don't find that Article 15C is reached, that there is targeted violence and that it is widespread, and that there is also widespread violent crime as well. Also, the lack of a tazkira, the identity document, will render somebody more likely to harassment from the authorities. And tazkiras have to be obtained from a person's home region. They can't be obtained in Kabul. So that's likely to be a disadvantage to somebody, albeit that the general finding is that even without one, that doesn't mean that somebody is necessarily at risk. The other interesting point, though, is that AS Safety in Kabul does not actually treat directly or make specific findings under Article 3. It does look at Article 8, but it doesn't specifically look at Article 3. So again, that's another point that you can take into consideration when looking at how it is you're going to mount your claim on behalf of your clients. Headnote 3 comes under the heading Reasonableness of Internal Relocation to Kabul, and says that having regard to the security and humanitarian situation in Kabul, as well as the difficulties faced by the population living there, it will not, in general, be unreasonable or unduly harsh for a single adult male in good health to relocate to Kabul, even if he does not have any specific connections or support network in Kabul, and even if he does not have a tazkira. So that really is coming along to the key points that we need to deal with today, because we're talking about single adult male in good health. Coming on to Headnote 4, and I'm going to develop this in a little bit more detail. And again, it's still under the reasonableness heading. However, the particular circumstances of an individual applicant must be taken into account in the context of conditions, in the place of relocation, well, that's going to be Kabul, including a person's age, the nature and quality of support network connections with Kabul or Afghanistan in general, their physical and mental health, their language, education, vocational skills, when determining whether a person falls within the general position set out above. So to come back to that general position is single, adult, male, in good health. Given the limited options for employment, capability to undertake manual work may be relevant. And that last line is in particular is in reference to the fact that somebody going back that doesn't really have a network of support, doesn't have family connections, tribal connections, or any other form of support, is going to find it quite difficult to obtain anything remotely resembling regular employment. There is a lot of casual employment, and a lot of that is in construction work. So that is why that has been specifically highlighted in this headnote. But there's 2 points that I wanted to make at this stage in respect of that finding, is that AS at Kabul, safety in Kabul, they do not adopt the UNHCR eligibility guidelines. They were in front of them, and indeed the UNHCR were actually a party to the proceedings when it went up to the Court of Appeal, but they were no longer a party to the proceedings when it came back to the upper tribunal at the end of 2019. But the tribunal did obviously have the eligibility guidelines in front of them, and the findings that they have made are in full cognizance of what those guidelines say. So whereas in the past we might have included the guidelines in a bundle in a way of trying to differentiate from what the previous country guidance was saying, now we have country guidance that incorporates it, albeit that in general key points of the guidelines are rejected. And in particular, the one position that the UNHCR holds that AS does not hold is that relocation is generally not available. AS says, no, we don't agree with that. We've heard all the evidence, we've looked at all the documents, we've heard from all the experts, and we disagree. We say that it is generally available for somebody who is young, single, male, healthy. So that's the position that we now find ourselves in. But when you're preparing to make a claim or dealing with a claim for protection, in my view, the key point is to have a look at paragraph 252 of AS, which sets it out succinctly. In all cases, an individualised case-by-case assessment is required, taking into account an individual's personal circumstances, including factors such as age, health, disability, languages, education, professional background, length of time outside of Afghanistan, connections to and experience of Kabul, and family situation and relationships. So essentially what we're trying to do is to listen very carefully to our clients and try and identify if there is anything that takes them outside of that box of young, single, male who's healthy. And if we are able to identify that, there is a good chance that we can put in a good argument to make sure that they succeed in their protection claim. If there is nothing about their characteristics that takes them outside of that box, then sadly, the way things are at the moment, it really is looking like that they're not going to succeed in a protection claim. I'm just going to go on to the last head note, and this is split up into 2 sections. And this is, again, still under the heading of reasonableness of internal relocation to Kabul. A person with a support network or specific connections in Kabul is likely to be in a more advantageous position on return, which may counter a particular vulnerability of an individual on return. So, for example, if you have somebody who came as an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child, but who has family or a family connection or some other connection in Kabul, the fact that he was vulnerable when he arrived nevertheless would be mitigated by his ability to have a network to turn to upon return. So that's a point that's important to bear in mind as well. The next part is a person without a network may be able to develop one following return, and I'll go on to the next part of that. And what the head note says is a person's familiarity with the cultural and societal norms of Afghanistan, which may be affected by the age at which he left the country and his length of absence, will be relevant to whether, and if so, how quickly and successfully he will be able to build a network. So again, it's about listening to our clients, trying to establish whether there are any differences such that it would be harder for them to reintegrate and to build a network of support once they arrive, to be able to support themselves. And one of the things that comes up an awful lot in Afghan cases is issues of mental health. So that's something that I wanted to focus on in a little bit more detail here. I do deal with a fair number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and almost all of them feature mental health problems at some level or another. This again is addressed, I think I've put 43, but it should be 83, paragraph 83 of AS Safety in Kabul. But also there's the subsequent case of DH, a particular social group, which means that people with serious mental health problems can now be considered as members of a particular social group in some circumstances. So I'll be looking a little bit more at that as well. So just to summarise the first part of this webinar, the key points, the key takeaways, I would say, is make sure and listen to your clients, but also see how they're presenting. How do your clients present? Because, of course, bearing in mind that there is this social stigma around mental health problems, they may be suffering from mental health problems and be unwilling to let you know that because they feel that it's some kind of slight on their character to have to admit that. So if you have any inkling, certainly with youngsters as well, if they have a social worker, you could maybe contact a social worker. I'm obviously in some circumstances teaching my grandmother how to suck eggs here, but be alive to that as a problem that might arise that may not be evident immediately. And if you do think that it's fairly evident that there may be a problem, try and get funding as quickly as you can to get an expert report done. So to go on to the particular paragraphs in AS, and it was Dr. Ahmad who cited the World Health Organization, that a fifth of people in post-conflict settings have depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And she also went on to say that public health care is of poor quality, medication is frequently counterfeit. She also referred to attacks on medical staff, and there are security concerns where hospitals and medical centres have been targeted by terrorist attacks, which means that sometimes that affects the ability of somebody to be able to access the healthcare safely. She also talked about there being inadequate psychiatric services and only one mental health hospital in Afghanistan, one in the whole country, which is located in Kabul, but it only has 60 beds for inpatients and 40 beds in a separate facility for drug addicts. And it was her view that there is little understanding in Afghanistan of mental health, and people with mental health conditions are stigmatized and socially ostracized. Again, these are all matters that can be taken into account. Coming on to DH, DH particular social group, I mean, I've not gone through the head notes on this. The first head note is whether or not, as a matter of construction of the various provisions, mental health could even be a particular social group, but that was overcome. But what, and I think it's Judge Hanson points out, and it's quite important, is that we have this kind of umbrella term of mental disability. But as he says, that encompasses both mental ill health, learning disabilities, developmental disorders, neurodiverse conditions, and brain damage. But there are fundamental differences between these conditions, and they shouldn't be confused. And then there's also another range of mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, personality disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc., and other mental impairments as well. So it's important to be clear what it is you think that your client needs help with, and refer to an appropriate expert, be that a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And as pointed out, obviously the degree of disability in each individual's case will vary enormously. So, for example, somebody who has low to medium level depression, but who has successfully been treated with CBT or with citalopram or something similar, is not going to be deemed to be at risk on return without more. And similarly, if an appellant is claiming to belong to a PSG based on mental health, it must be that the person is suffering from a serious mental illness. And as the judge says, I use the term serious mental illness as there are a number of mental health issues which can in themselves vary in degree, but which enable a person to function without any obvious external indicators or risk factors, as noted above. So what is a serious mental illness? That includes diagnoses of psychosis, something that would require a high level of care, but importantly and interestingly, he says, and which may require hospital treatment. So somebody doesn't have to be so mentally ill or mentally disabled that they have to be sectioned or require permanent hospital treatment or permanent care. As he goes on to say, it's a fact-sensitive question in every case, and the identification was not, in fact, disputed before him. So the identification of serious mental illness being something that is beyond low levels of depression and possibly even beyond PTSD, except in particular circumstances, which I'll come on to in a moment, can nevertheless still amount to somebody being part of a particular social group. And as he goes on to say, it's not in dispute that the assessment must be made at the date of the decision or on appeal at the date of hearing. That's something I think we all know, but what that means very importantly is we can't turn up to court with a report that's 6 months or a year out of date. It's important where possible, especially if you're able to get the funding to do so, to make sure that you have a relatively recent up-to-date report of somebody's mental health. So again, to summarise all of that, again, we're going back to this principle of a single, young, healthy male being able to go back to Afghanistan. And on the face of it, AS safety in Kabul looks quite harsh, but there are, I would say, a considerable number of different avenues for people who don't fit that particular matrix. And it's important to be alive to what those issues are, and in particular, being alive to mental health problems as well. In terms of what he was saying earlier about people, different levels of care and so forth. The other thing that I would want to point out at this stage as well is that we can't be speculative about what would happen to somebody who, say, for example, they've been through 6 months of CBT. That form of CBT would not be available to them. Perhaps the drugs that they need would not be available to them in Afghanistan if they would have a relapse. But we can't speculate that the likelihood of relapse without having a professional report. And for example, it would be a perfectly proper question to put to an expert, well, what are the conditions in which, or what are the events that might occur which would be likely to cause our client to relapse in his mental health? That's a perfectly correct question to put to a psychiatrist. But you can't speculate that because somebody has suffered this and they're still kind of suffering at the moment, but they're not having treatment anymore, that they are likely to suffer again without more evidence. So in summary, what we're looking at is the different avenues that are open to us, in order that that very strict provision of AS safety in Kabul doesn't apply to our clients. Now, I'm going to stop the sharing now, because I think we've probably got some questions. I know that the lovely Keisha has been looking at questions.
Maybe just worth saying that if any of you do have questions at the moment, it's best to put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat. So if you've got questions for Jane, please go ahead and ask them now, and she'll do her very best to answer them.
Thank you.
Coming in now.
So it's a question from Elliot Cohen of Clifford Chance. Good afternoon, Elliot. Actually, if you have a look at the case of DH, what is interesting about that case is that the appellant in that case was undiagnosed. They couldn't actually do a diagnosis because his mental health was so appalling, and he just was not able to engage with mental health services. If it's just a matter of reluctance, I think it would just have to be down to your powers of persuasion to stress just how important it is to your client's case that he seek professional help, and that you have the notes and a report of that professional help. Because if he doesn't, the chances are the tribunal will deem him to be young, fit and healthy enough to go back to Kabul. And none of us want that to happen. So I hope that answers your question.
I think that's the only question that's come in for now, Jane.
Okay. Well, look, thank you all very much indeed for attending this afternoon. I'm just going to share a final screen, if I may, which is, beg your pardon, Keisha's much better at this than I am, you know. So it's just to say thank you very much for attending this afternoon. As you can see, there are contact details, both for me directly by email and also the General Clerk's contact details. Once again, thank you very much, Keisha, for your fantastic technical support today. Really, really pleased with that. There is some further reading as well. Actually, I just noticed that there are some more questions that have come up, so I will finish with this screen and then I'll come back to answering questions if I can. But there's some further reading. There's a very, very good article that came out in Free Movement in May of last year. After this webinar is over, we will be sending out the slides for this webinar, and there will be a hyperlink that will take you to that article, but it goes into considerably more detail about AS than I've been able to go into today. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, and I'm going to have a look at the other questions. Right, let me see. Sorry, coming back to Elliot. Elliot has another question going on from his other one, saying, is there a place we can find experts on this particular issue? Do you mean experts in people? I'm not sure whether you mean experts in people who refuse to seek assistance, or whether experts in general. But again, it's possible that an expert psychologist or psychiatrist could be able to write a report saying it is common for people in this circumstance not to want to admit, or maybe a country expert, if there's a country expert that has a particular knowledge about social stigma in Afghanistan. That might help. Other than that, I'm sorry, I don't think I can answer any further than that. The next question is from Georgina O'Reilly. Thank you. In terms of learning disabilities, what would you stress? High level of social care required rather than medication counselling? I think both, actually, Georgina. If somebody cannot function because of a learning disability, then they're certainly not going to be able to function in Kabul on their own. I think highlighting both is the important thing to do. And a final question from Peggy Fard. A client of mine sustained a serious head injury 10 years ago, psychotic illnesses, recovered, feels he can manage without medication now. Helpful if he could follow up examination. It wouldn't do any harm. What you're really looking for then is a prognosis. And again, the sort of questions that you would want to be putting to a neurologist is, okay, maybe, yeah, a neurologist is what is the likelihood of this worsening over time, and, you know, in what circumstances or what events are likely to have an adverse effect on him. I think that would be the way to look at that. And Fozzie, protection case is unlikely to succeed for a young single male in light of country guidance. Are the tribunal likely to give serious consideration to very significant obstacles? I can only really talk from my own experience. I think I've only had one asylum case, and it was a woman in an African country, where I failed under asylum, but I succeeded under Article 8. But she was a woman who had a child here, and her child was very poorly. So I think that was the reason that I succeeded on that. The thing is that when you're looking at asylum, obviously you're looking at things that are lower standard, whereas Article 8 is on a balance of probabilities. But having said that, if you layer it all up, which obviously you're entitled to do when looking at Article 8. So instead of looking at things in silos, you just layer all these problems up together and make submissions on the fact that all of these problems, whilst individually they're not determinative of on their own, when taken as a whole, outbalance the Secretary of State's requirement to control immigration, there may be a chance of succeeding, yes. I'm not sure if there's anything else I can help with. But thank you all again. Thank you very much for attending. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. I hope it hasn't been too dry and too boring. And I look forward to seeing you again. Just one final word. There are many of these that have been recorded and put up on our YouTube site on a variety of different subjects, including one that Keisha did on, well, Keisha's might not be uploaded yet, but Keisha did a very good one on mental health on Tuesday. So just Google Goldsmith Chambers YouTube, and you will find a whole variety of these mini webinars, and they're very good for CPD. So I hope you all have a lovely evening, and thank you very much again.